The historian Howard Zinn once said, "There is not a country in world history in which racism has been more important for so long a time as the United States." This history of racism has gone through several phases, beginning with centuries of slavery and followed by decades of segregation. And it was during these years of segregation when we see the true ugliness of white supremacy and the absolute bravery of black resistance and resilience. After slavery was abolished in 1865, a new era began called Reconstruction, which was all about reconstructing the country and rebuilding a new South after the chaos of the Civil War. And one of the most important parts of this Reconstruction was black Americans entering their new role as citizens and not slaves. In the former Confederacy, black Americans began voting and participating in politics like never before. During this period, more than 800 black men served in state legislatures, and in some places like South Carolina, the state government was almost all black. However, this racial progress was short-lived, because 12 years after Reconstruction began, a deal was struck to allow white people in the South to regain control of their states and reassert their rule of white supremacy. In the presidential election of 1876, Republican Rutherford B. Hayes ran against Democrat Samuel J. Tilden. Tilden won the popular vote, but neither man won enough electoral votes to win the election, so a congressional commission was formed to decide the winner. The Democrats on the commission decided to support Hayes for the presidency on one condition. If Hayes became president, he had to withdraw federal troops from the South and let white Southerners deal with their black residents how they saw fit. Hayes agreed to these conditions and was awarded the presidency in one of the most corrupt elections in U.S. history. From that point forward, he was known as Rutherford B. Hayes. As soon as Hayes became president, white people in the South embarked on a reign of terror against black Americans. They retook control of their states and purged them of all black politicians. These new all-white state governments passed a series of laws called Black Codes, which came to be known as Jim Crow. These Jim Crow laws deprived black people of their right to vote and segregated blacks and whites in every single public space. Tennessee passed the first Jim Crow segregation law in 1881, mandating the separation of blacks and whites in railroad cars. Historian Jill Lepore describes how segregation soon spread across the entire South. She tells us that courthouses provided separate Bibles, bars provided separate stools, post offices mandated separate windows, playgrounds had separate swings. In Birmingham, for a black child to play checkers with a white child in a public park became a crime. Here's a political cartoon from that time period making a joke about a segregated airplane. But segregation wasn't a joke, it was deathly serious, and it touched upon every single aspect of life. In fact, even cemeteries were segregated, so that black and white people could not even be equal in death. In 1896, the Supreme Court decided that segregation was legal in their decision in Plessy versus Ferguson. Now, segregation would be the law of the land until the Civil Rights Act of 1964. One of the most powerful ways to tell this story of segregation is to look at photographs from this time period. These pictures capture the ugly reality of a world dominated by white supremacy. One of the most contentious areas during the age of segregation was housing. Many white Americans fought tooth and nail to keep their neighborhoods all white, and they were enraged by the idea of having black neighbors. This was the case when a federal housing project called the Sojourner Truth Project opened in Detroit, Michigan in 1942 to deal with the housing shortage for black families in the area. As soon as the project was announced, white residents began protesting and attempting to prevent black families from moving in. They put up a sign directly across from the housing project that read, "We want white tenants in our white community." The day before black families were scheduled to move in, hundreds of white people showed up outside the housing project to protest. When black families did try to move in, the white mob attacked them and prevented them from moving into their homes for weeks. The next month, black families had to be protected from the white mob by 1,500 police officers who had to escort them into their homes. However, the racial tension did not stop. A year later, Detroit exploded in a race riot that ended in 34 fatalities, 25 of which were black people. Another flashpoint in the era of segregation was public schools. White Americans in the South fought to keep their schools all white, and when there was any talk of admitting black students, they went insane. In 1954, the Supreme Court ruled in Brown versus Education that racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. However, across the South, state governors began to defy the federal government by denying black students admission into white schools. In 1957, the governor of Arkansas, Orville Faubus, sent 250 National Guardsmen to Central High School in Little Rock to keep black children out. In an interview, he said if black kids try to get into that school, blood will run in the streets. When 9 black students were enrolled in that high school and tried to attend their first day of class, a white mob followed them through the streets, harassing and terrorizing them. One of those students was 15-year-old Elizabeth Eckford. In this famous photograph, we can see Eckford being chased by a white girl named Hazel, who was part of the crowd chanting, "Lynch her." Photographers captured many more powerful moments in this struggle, such as this picture from 1960, showing federal marshals escorting 6-year-old Ruby Bridges to a formerly all-white elementary school in New Orleans to protect her from the white mob. Another area where segregation dominated American life was in stores and restaurants. In the 1960s, black activists began staging protests in these Jim Crow establishments. One of the most popular forms of protest was the sit-in, where black activists would intentionally sit in white-only sections to protest these racist laws. One of these protests took place in 1963 in Jackson, Mississippi, when college students and faculty decided to sit in the whites-only section at a lunch counter. During this protest, a violent white mob harassed these brave men and women, including a black student named Ann Moody. The white mob screamed in their ears and poured sugar, salt, flour, mustard, and ketchup on their heads. While this went on, police stood by and watched, refusing to do anything. Activists like Ann Moody had been trained by groups like the NAACP and SNCC to endure harassment like this. One of the ways they prepared for this kind of treatment was to have fellow activists repeatedly blow cigarette smoke in their faces. Other times, they even ashed cigarettes on their heads to make sure they were able to remain calm and strong in the face of any provocation. One of the most disturbing pictures from this period of segregation and protest came from Florida in 1964. In this year, a group of activists decided to stage a swim-in to protest a hotel's policy of only allowing white people to swim in their pool. When black and white protesters jumped into the pool, the hotel manager James Brock came out and dumped acid into the pool to terrorize them and get them to leave. A day after that picture was taken, the Civil Rights Act was approved by the U.S. government, instituting a new era in American history free of segregation. But as we all know, even if segregation was defeated, racism was here to stay. This history of segregation is so critical to remember because no matter how much progress we think we've made as a nation, that progress is always in danger of being rolled back and erased. It's also important to remember this history because this is exactly the kind of history that is currently under attack in this country. There are many people who don't want you to learn about this country's history of racism and intolerance. They want to make you think that this country was always great, when the reality is much different. The truth is, we still have so much work to do before the word great can ever be applied to the United States.